This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or actual events is purely coincidental. Before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it now. Every day we bring you a new story, and every week a lesson that stays in your soul. Make sure to hit the bell icon too, because you won't want to miss what's coming next. There is an old saying in the rural towns of West Texas that the old-timers repeat with that slow, measured voice of someone who has seen a bit too much in life. What the good Lord takes with one hand, he gives back double with the other. Raymond Vance had heard that saying since he was a little boy, sitting on the porch steps of the ranch while his grandfather drank black coffee and watched the golden horizon of the plains. For many years he thought it was just old folks talking, one of those empty phrases people repeat when they don't know what to say in the face of someone else's pain. But in 1984, when everything he had built over 42 years crumbled in less than 12 months, Raymond began to understand the true weight of those words. First went the ranch, 800 acres of red dirt in the Texas Panhandle, land his father had sweat blood to buy and that he had sweat even more to keep. Then went Marlene, his wife of 17 years, who left on a May morning without screaming, without slamming doors, without making a scene. She simply packed a small suitcase, looked at him with those eyes he could never quite forget, and told him she was tired of loving a ghost. She said he had lost himself along with the cattle, along with the debts, and along with the 3-year drought that had dried up not only the land, but also something deep inside his chest. Raymond stood on the wraparound porch, watching her car disappear down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of red dust in its wake. He didn't run after her. He didn't call out. He just stood there until the sun went down, and when it got dark, he went inside, sat in his father's old armchair, and for the first time in many years, wept without an ounce of shame. This is the story of a man who lost everything he thought he needed to be somebody, and of a woman who lost everything in a single night of fire, and of how a storm, a real storm, with lightning, thunder, and torrential rain, put them in the exact same place at the exact same time. To understand the magnitude of Raymond's fall, you have to understand the sheer size of what he had. The Good Hope Ranch was founded by his grandfather in 1931, right at the peak of the Dust Bowl that devastated the American heartland, but also hit the Texas plains with brutal force. While a lot of folks were selling off their land for pennies, old man Custis Vance was buying. He had the vision of a simple countryman who knows that the earth doesn't lie, that fertile soil always bounces back and produces when treated with respect. And he was right. Within 30 years, Good Hope had become one of the most respected ranches in the county, boasting top-quality Angus cattle, fields of wheat and sorghum, and a main house that looked more like a city mansion than a farmhouse. Thick limestone walls, a slate roof, and a wide porch with wrought iron railings. Raymond inherited all of this from his father in 1972, when he was 30 years old and newly married to Marlene Gallagher, the daughter of the local pharmacist. Back then, he was what the older folks called a young man with prospects. Handsome, hard-working, and the bearer of a respected last name. The whole town had gone to the wedding. The priest had blessed the union with that traditional Latin no one really understood, but everyone respected. And Raymond had stepped into that ranch with the absolute certainty that his life was exactly where it was supposed to be. The trouble started in 1981. The drought crept in slowly, as they often do. At first, it just seemed like a normal dry spell. The creek dropped a few inches, the pastures turned a bit yellower than usual. Raymond wasn't worried. The following year, the drought worsened. The creek dropped further. The herd started losing weight. He went to the bank for the first time in his life to take out a loan for feed, certain that in 6 months everything would be sorted out. But the autumn rains that should have poured down came in as a light drizzle, far from enough. By 1983, the situation was dire. By 1984, it was terminal. When the bank came to foreclose the mortgage in March of that year, Raymond was 42, carrying a debt that swallowed the entire ranch and then some, and trapped in a marriage that had survived prosperity but couldn't withstand defeat. Marlene wasn't a bad woman. She was simply a woman who had married an idea of a life, and when that idea unraveled, she realized she no longer knew the man sleeping next to her. Raymond had shut down. He stopped talking, stopped laughing, stopped making plans. He would spend hours on the porch staring at the dead grass, as if expecting the pasture to turn green through sheer force of will. In May 1984, Marlene left. In September of that same year, Raymond signed the deeds transferring Good Hope Ranch to the bank. He walked away with one suitcase, a beat-up Chevy truck they let him keep out of pity, and $800 that was all that remained of 40 years of family legacy. He drove down to San Angelo, a mid-sized town where he had a distant cousin named Silas who ran an auto repair shop. Silas took him in without asking questions, gave him a small back room, and taught Raymond how to wrench on diesel engines. For almost a year, Raymond worked in the shop, in total silence, performing mechanical tasks with the focused attention of a man who needs to keep his hands busy so his mind won't wander. The shop's customers had no idea that the quiet mechanic with grease-stained hands had been, until very recently, one of the most prominent ranchers in the Panhandle. About 40 miles from where Raymond was trying to relearn how to exist, in a small town called Winters, with its wide backyards and brick-paved Main Street, lived Constance Miller, known to everyone simply as Connie. Connie was 37 in 1985. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, teaching 1st through 4th grades with that deep patience that only those with a true calling can maintain. She was single by choice, or at least that's what she'd say when the neighbor ladies pried. And the neighbor ladies in small towns pry quite a bit, with that nosiness perfectly disguised as southern hospitality. The truth was, she had been engaged once to a boy from Lubbock named Garrett, but the engagement lasted only 8 months. It ended because Garrett found someone else while Connie was taking care of her terminally ill mother. After that, Connie decided she preferred the peace of her own life over the gamble of an uncertain life with someone else. She lived in her childhood home. Her parents had passed away, her father of a heart attack in '78, her mother of pneumonia in '82, and she had inherited the house. It was modest but sturdy, a few rooms, hardwood floors, and a backyard garden bursting with cilantro, parsley, jalapenos, and a prolific Meyer lemon tree that gave more fruit than she could ever use. She also had a dark cedar chest her grandmother had brought over from Germany at the turn of the century, filled with old letters, yellowed photographs, a wooden rosary with beads that felt like bone, and a handmade lace quilt that had never been used because it was meant for the bridal trousseau of the wedding that never happened. On the night of June 14, 1985, a Friday, Connie was asleep when the fire broke out. To this day, no one knows exactly what caused it. Some say it was a candle she left burning on her nightstand after her evening prayers. Others say it was faulty wiring the city had hastily installed on her block the year before. What is certain is that when Connie woke up to the smell of smoke, her bedroom ceiling was already engulfed in flames. She escaped with only what she had on, a white cotton nightgown, the slippers next to her bed, and the silver cross she had worn around her neck since her confirmation. The cedar chest, her parents' photos, the lace quilt, the lesson plan notebooks she had accumulated over 11 years of teaching, the book she cherished, the wooden lockbox with her savings, it all remained inside the house, which collapsed into ash in less than an hour. The neighbors rushed over with garden hoses, but there wasn't much to be done. Betty, the owner of the local grocery store, took Connie in for the night. By morning, Connie was sitting on a chair in Betty's kitchen, holding a mug of hot tea, staring blankly into space when someone asked if she was okay. Connie said yes. It was an automatic response, the kind of thing you say when the question is just too massive to be answered honestly. The mayor stopped by to offer his condolences and promised municipal help that never really materialized. The county provided emergency rent for 3 months in a tiny studio behind the pharmacy. The school where she worked took up a collection so she could buy basic clothes and toiletries. Her students made a collective drawing. Each child drew one thing they wanted Miss Connie to have in her new house, and handed it to her on a Thursday afternoon. Connie broke down crying in front of all the kids, and the kids, not fully understanding why she was crying, cried right along with her. In August 1985, when the emergency rent was running out and she still hadn't managed to replace anything substantial, the school district superintendent from the neighboring town of San Angelo sent a letter. He asked if she'd be interested in a position at the public elementary school there, which was desperately short a teacher for the lower grades. The salary was a bit better. There was a small teacher's cottage available behind the schoolhouse, tiny but rent-free, and she would start in September. Connie accepted without hesitation. There was nothing left holding her in winters. She packed her bags. Everything she owned now fit into 2 duffels and moved to San Angelo. At the time, San Angelo was a proud mid-sized town, big enough to have amenities, but small enough to keep its country soul. It had a movie theater, a country club, and a weekend farmers market that was a wonderful, chaotic mix of voices and smells. It also had, right on Main Street, an auto repair shop with the name Silas & Co., painted on a wooden sign that had been peeling for 2 years because no one had the time to fix it. It was on a Friday in September during market day that Raymond and Connie's paths crossed for the very first time, though in a way neither of them found significant. Connie was buying vegetables with the little money she had, carefully picking the greenest bell peppers and politely haggling over the price of tomatoes with an older woman at a corner stall. Raymond was walking by, holding a greasy alternator wrapped in a shop rag, on his way to return it to a customer who lived near the square. They passed within 3 feet of each other. She had her back to him. He glanced over for a second, saw nothing out of the ordinary, just a regular woman buying groceries, and kept walking. The real encounter happened 6 weeks later, on an October night, when the storm rolled in. Before that, though, we need to talk about what happened between Raymond and the town during that period, because Raymond wasn't just fixing trucks, he was also slowly trying to reconnect with the world, even if he didn't quite know how. His cousin Silas was a talker, the kind of guy who befriends every customer and knows their kids' names. Through daily exposure, Raymond was introduced to the townsfolk almost by accident. There was Walt, the gas station owner, who came in every Tuesday to complain about the same rattle in his Ford Galaxy that never really got fixed, because he refused to replace the gasket. There was Mrs. Eunice, a retired teacher who brought her yellow VW bug in for tune-ups and used the time to tell local tall tales that made Silas roar with laughter. There was Gerald, a young city councilman who loved to talk politics, while Raymond just listened in silence, never chiming in. Bit by bit, Raymond's walls began to crack. He didn't revert to the expansive, outgoing man he had been in another life, but his shell opened just a fraction. He started greeting people by name. He started listening to their stories with genuine interest. On Sundays, he started going down to Zeke's diner to play dominoes with the other men, sitting near the window as the sun dipped slowly behind the oak trees. But there was still a massive, hollow loneliness inside him, a loneliness he couldn't quite name, which he sometimes confused with homesickness for the ranch, and other times recognized as something entirely different, the absence not of a place, but of someone to share the heavy burden of being alive. The storm of October 1985 was, according to the old-timers of San Angelo, the fiercest in at least 20 years. It started as a stifling, muggy afternoon, the kind that makes dogs lay flat on the cool porch stones and chickens refuse to eat. The sky darkened slowly from the west, a thick wall of black clouds advancing with a grim determination that left no room for doubt. It was going to pour, and it was going to pour now. Connie had left school later than usual that Friday. A staff meeting had run long, and afterwards she stayed to organize the children's workbooks she needed to grade over the weekend. When she finally stepped out at 6 o'clock, the sky was the color of lead, and the wind had turned strangely warm. That heavy electric pre-rain breeze folks in Texas know all too well. She walked, as she always did. The cottage behind the school was only a few blocks away. But the rain caught her before she could get there, and it didn't start as a drizzle. It dropped all at once with that terrifying force of an autumn plains thunderstorm, as if the entire sky had decided to cave in. Within seconds, she was drenched. The wind violently inverted the umbrella she tried to open. A lightning bolt struck close enough that the thunderclap made the concrete sidewalk vibrate under her feet. Connie sprinted toward the first awning she saw, the overhang of a mechanic shop on Main Street. The metal bay door was cracked open, and a light was on inside. She squeezed herself under the narrow overhang, clutching her students' workbooks to her chest to protect them from the deluge, when she heard a voice, "Come on in, you're getting soaked." She looked over. Standing in the gap of the bay door was a man of average height, broad-shouldered, with grease-stained hands, a shop rag thrown over his shoulder, and a tired but gentle demeanor. Raymond had stayed late at the shop to finish a job and had heard the frantic footsteps outside. She stepped inside. The interior of the garage had that sharp, distinct smell of motor oil, burnt rubber and metal, a scent that instantly reminded Connie of her father's tool shed, a smell that, oddly enough, brought her comfort. There was a workbench cluttered with parts, 2 cars hoisted up on hydraulic lifts, and in the corner, a small hot plate with a battered kettle. Raymond walked over to the kettle without asking and put water on to boil. "Have a seat right there," he said, pointing to a wooden bench pushed against the wall. "Wait out the rain." She sat down. They stayed in silence for a while. Not an awkward silence, but the comfortable quiet of 2 people who are used to being alone and feel no urge to fill the air with meaningless chatter. Outside, the rain hammered against the tin roof with such a deafening roar that any conversation would have been useless anyway. When the thunder finally gave them a brief truce and the rain lost a bit of its fury, Raymond brought over 2 mugs of instant coffee. Connie thanked him. He sat down on the far end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance, and drank his coffee while watching the rain flood the street. "You a teacher?" he asked, not looking directly at her, just nodding toward the workbook she was still holding tight. "I am. At the public school." "You teach the little ones?" "First and second grade." He nodded slowly. Another stretch of silence. Then she asked, more out of politeness than curiosity, "Do you work here?" "I do. I'm a mechanic." She looked at his hands, large, weathered by heavy labor, with those dark lines of grease settled deep into the knuckles that don't wash out, no matter how hard you scrub. They looked like her father's hands, hands she immediately recognized as honest. They barely spoke more than that. The rain took another 40 minutes to die down enough for her to leave. When she stood up to go, he mentioned she could wait a bit longer, since lightning was still flashing. She told him she had to go, she had a lot of grading to do. He just said, "All right," and stood by the open bay door, watching to make sure she crossed the flooded street safely. No names were exchanged. Nothing happened besides a shared cup of coffee and a shared silence. But Raymond lingered at the shop door much longer than necessary, staring down the empty street long after she had disappeared around the corner. And there was something, a strange lightness, a spark of warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee, that he couldn't quite pinpoint, but that stayed with him as he locked the padlocks and killed the lights. Small towns have a unique quality, or flaw depending on the day, of forcing people to run into each other. It's not like the big city where you can go years without seeing the same face twice. In San Angelo in 1985, if you went to the grocery store, to church, to the diner, or to the pharmacy, you inevitably bumped into the same people. Their second encounter happened at Sunday Mass, 2 weeks after the storm. Raymond wasn't a regular churchgoer. He went occasionally, more out of childhood habit than deep conviction, carrying that practical Southern faith that is as much a social routine as a spiritual one. That morning, Silas had dragged him out. "Come on, go with me. We're having Sunday dinner at the house afterward with Carol." Raymond obliged. St. Mary's Catholic Church sat right near downtown, with its white stone facade and a bell that rang sharply at 7:30. Raymond was sitting in the back pew, as he preferred, when she walked in, the teacher from the rainstorm. She didn't see him right away. She walked down the aisle and sat 3 pews ahead. Next to an older woman, he later learned, was Mrs. Bernice, the retired town librarian and Connie's only close friend in San Angelo. Throughout the Mass, his eyes kept wandering involuntarily to the back of her neck. Her dark hair was pulled up in a simple, unadorned bun, with one loose curl that the morning heat had already undone. There was something about the way she sat, spine perfectly straight, deeply attentive, like someone raised to show utmost respect for where she was, that he found profoundly beautiful, though he couldn't explain why. On the way out, on the stone steps of the church, their eyes finally met. She recognized the mechanic. He saw the recognition in her eyes. There was a subtle nod from both of them, the kind of greeting that requires no words because words would disrupt the quiet understanding they had. But Silas, who knew everybody in the county, was already shaking Mrs. Bernice's hand and pulling Raymond by the arm. "Hey, let me introduce you. Ray, this is Mrs. Bernice and this is Miss Connie, the new teacher over at the elementary." "We've met," Connie said, offering a small, polite smile. Briefly. "Yeah," Raymond confirmed. "She had coffee with me during that awful downpour." Silas flashed a mile-wide grin and immediately did what extroverted people do when they smell a potential story. He created a setup without making it look like one. "Well, what a happy coincidence. Listen, Connie, we're heading over to the house for Sunday dinner right now. Why don't you and Mrs. Bernice join us?" Mrs. Bernice had prior engagements. Connie, after a single second of hesitation that Raymond caught and studied, said yes. Sunday dinner at Silas's house was a true southern spread. Smoked brisket, pinto beans with jalapeno sausage, potato salad, and a cast-iron skillet of homemade cornbread. Silas's wife, Carol, was the kind of woman who considered it a personal insult if anyone left her table less than stuffed. The conversation flowed easily, steered by Silas's natural charm, telling wild stories from the auto shop with the animated energy of a man who knows how to hold a room. Raymond was quieter than usual, but it was a different kind of quiet than his usual brooding. It was the silence of a man paying deep attention, and he was paying attention to Connie. She spoke naturally without putting on airs. When Silas asked where she was from, she told them about Winters, about the school, about the house fire, telling the story simply, without playing the victim, but without pretending it hadn't been devastating. She explained that she had lost everything, that it was hard, and that she came to San Angelo because the superintendent offered her a job, and she figured starting over somewhere new was better than staring at the ashes of her old life every day. "You lost everything and just picked up and started over," Carol said with genuine admiration. "That takes real grit." "I don't know if it's grit," Connie said, thinking it over. "Sometimes it's just having no other option and finding out you can endure a whole lot more than you thought." Raymond felt that sentence land heavy right in the center of his chest. It was exactly that. There was no other option. And in the process of having no other option, he had discovered that he had the brains to rebuild diesel engines, that he could sleep in a cramped back room without losing his mind, and that his family's prestigious last name wasn't what defined him as a man. After dinner, while Silas and Carol were washing dishes in the kitchen, making that comfortable, noisy clatter of a long-married couple, Raymond and Connie stayed out on the back porch, drinking coffee. He asked her about the kids at school. Her face lit up. There was a spark in her eyes when she talked about her students that was impossible to fake. She told him about a boy who had shown up not knowing how to hold a pencil and how, within 3 weeks, he was writing his own name. She talked about a little girl who was terrified of making mistakes and how Connie was slowly teaching her that messing up is just part of learning. "Must be real rewarding," Raymond said. "It's what gets me out of bed in the morning," she replied, without romanticizing it, just pure honesty. He told her a little about the ranch, not everything. He wasn't ready to bear it all yet, but he mentioned that he had lost his father's land, that it had been a bitter pill to swallow, and that he was working at his cousin's shop trying to figure out how to live again. He said it with an objective calm that she instantly recognized was not coldness. It was the tone of a man who had processed his grief so deeply that the words were now wiped clean of drama. "I ain't complaining, though," he said. "The world knocked me down hard, but I'm still standing." She looked at him with that evaluating gaze of a teacher who assesses without judging. "You look like the kind of man who stays standing." It was a simple compliment, but Raymond carried those words with him for the rest of the week. When it became clear that the two were spending time together, the town processed the information in various ways. Silas and his wife were thrilled, with that unpretentious joy of friends who love them both and hope it works out. Mrs. Bernice was happy in a reserved, dignified way. She was the kind of woman who didn't make a fuss, but you felt her approval when she squeezed Connie's hand just a second longer than necessary. Small towns have an extraordinary social radar. People don't need the local paper or the radio to know what's going on. There is an invisible network of glances, deductions, and front porch gossip that processes data at terrifying speeds. When Raymond started attending Sunday Mass regularly, something he had never done before, and when Connie started showing up at Zeke's diner on Sunday afternoons, and when the two were spotted talking outside the farmer's market on a Tuesday, the town reached its own conclusions. There was, in that town, a clique that ran the country club events, a group with very strict ideas about how things ought to be, especially regarding who should associate with whom. Mrs. Pearl Higgins was the wealthy widow of a prominent distributor. She had enough money to never work a day in her life, and enough free time to meddle in everyone else's. She was the kind of woman who knew exactly what everyone owed the bank, and she used that information not with overt cruelty, but with the venomous delicacy of someone who knows exactly how to slide a knife in while smiling. It was Mrs. Pearl who first mentioned, at a country club ladies' luncheon, that she found it so very interesting that the new teacher, who had arrived with literally the clothes on her back, bless her heart, was being seen fraternizing with the mechanic who, word has it, used to be quite the big-shot rancher, though Lord knows if that's true. The tone was laced with pity. The intent was entirely to belittle. Then there were Pearl's daughters, Valerie and Rose, women in their 20s who frequented the club and who had at different times shown interest in Raymond when he first arrived in San Angelo. Not because they fell in love, they were far too calculating for impulsive romance, but because there was something about him, about his stoic posture and quiet confidence, that suggested old money and deep roots, and it intrigued them. When he ignored both of them and instead paid attention to the humble schoolteacher, their frustration morphed into that specific brand of resentment that masquerades as concern. "She's just not in his league," Valerie told her mother, wearing the serious face of an objective social analyst. "What league?" Rose asked, a bit more grounded. "The man's a mechanic." "He was a rancher," Valerie corrected. "Blood will tell. People like that eventually bounce back." But Raymond knew nothing of this chatter, or perhaps he did, in that vague way a person senses they are being watched, and he simply didn't care. He was preoccupied with something much more urgent. He was discovering that he wanted to know Connie better, and that this desire was entirely different from anything he had felt in a very long time. It wasn't the frantic rush of youth. He wasn't 20 anymore. It was something heavier, more grounded and real, like when you've been dying of thirst for miles and finally stumble upon a clear, cold well. There was no grand, formal declaration. There was no candlelit dinner or bouquet of expensive roses. What happened was a series of Sundays that stacked on top of each other, building like bricks into something solid. The first Sunday was the dinner at Silas's house. The second was when, leaving church, he asked if she wanted to walk down to the city park. It had these massive, century-old live oak trees that threw wonderful shade. She said yes. They walked and talked for 2 hours, and when she finally checked her watch and said she needed to go prep her lesson plans for the week, there was a genuine reluctance to end the conversation that both of them felt, but neither voiced. The third Sunday, he showed up at her cottage with a whole rotisserie chicken he had picked up. He had learned to cook a bit over the last year, out of necessity rather than passion, and told her he figured she'd be hungry after grading papers all morning. She was. They ate in the tiny kitchen, sitting at the only table she owned, with her students' spelling tests pushed to one side. It was on that third Sunday that she asked about Marlene. Directly, no beating around the bush, exactly the way she approached all difficult subjects, looking him dead in the eye, stripping the question of any melodrama. He told her the truth. He spoke with the raw honesty of a man who no longer has an image to protect. He told her the failure belonged to both of them, that he had walled himself off in a place she couldn't reach, and that he understood why she left, even though it tore him to pieces. He told her he still prayed for her, and that he truly hoped she was doing well. Connie listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You're a fair man." "Why do you say that?" "Because you didn't turn her into the villain of the story. You easily could have, but you didn't." He spent days thinking about that. On the fourth Sunday, he showed up with a small sweet basil plant potted in an old Folgers coffee can. He had planted it in Silas's backyard specifically for her, because he had remembered her mentioning how much she missed having fresh herbs in her kitchen. She took the tin can with that careful reverence that humble people have when receiving something that actually matters, not with dramatic gasps, but with profound, quiet appreciation. "Do you know this is the most beautiful thing anyone has given me in a very long time," she said, "an old coffee can with some basil." "A living plant," she corrected him. something that requires care to grow. He didn't say anything. But something inside him, a door that had been boarded up for years, cracked open just a little wider. In November, the country club hosted the annual Heritage Gala, a big formal event that was the highlight of the social calendar for the specific crowd in San Angelo who believed the club was the center of the universe. There was a live swing band, an extravagant buffet, and that unwritten social code dictating who wore what designer and who sat at which table. Silas and his wife had tickets and dragged Raymond along. Connie went because Mrs. Bernice, who had been a legacy member since the days when the library actually had funding, invited her. Mrs. Pearl was there, naturally, flanking the room with her daughters Valerie and Rose, both wearing dresses explicitly chosen to turn heads. When Raymond walked in with Silas, Valerie approached immediately, flashing that rehearsed smile of a woman who practices in the mirror. "Raymond, what a wonderful surprise, it's been ages." Raymond greeted her politely. He had a gentleman's upbringing that functioned on autopilot, regardless of how he actually felt. They exchanged a few empty pleasantries. Rose joined them, a small circle formed, and for a few minutes he stood there answering questions about the auto shop, with the infinite patience of a man in no hurry. When Connie arrived on Mrs. Bernice's arm, Raymond's eyes darted immediately toward the entrance, a reflex he couldn't control, and Valerie noticed. And Mrs. Pearl, who was standing 10 feet away observing the room with an eagle's gaze pretending to be distracted, noticed too. What happened next was incredibly subtle, the way elegant cruelties usually are. Mrs. Pearl glided over to Connie with a radiant, warm smile, hugged her and asked about the school and the children. Connie answered graciously, suspecting nothing. Then Mrs. Pearl leaned in, adopting that tone of sisterly confidence that is actually a weapon. "Connie, my sweet girl, you're an educated woman, so sensible. You must know that sometimes men just need a soft place to land while they're recovering from life's hard blows. Poor Raymond lost everything, the ranch, his wife. It's natural he's looking for comfort. But surely you understand that a cattleman doesn't stay a grease monkey forever, right? Once his life gets back on track, well, priorities shift." It was a gut punch wrapped in velvet. The message was crystal clear. You are not enough for him once he becomes who he used to be. You are just a temporary band-aid. Connie heard every word. She didn't blush. She didn't snap back. She merely looked at Mrs. Pearl with that unshakable calm people develop when they've survived actual real-world tragedies. "Mrs. Higgins," she said, her voice steady as bedrock, "thank you so much for your concern. Have a lovely evening." And she walked away from the conversation, linking arms with Mrs. Bernice without rushing, without a hint of drama. Raymond, who was standing a few yards away and hadn't heard the words but had read the body language perfectly, walked over to her a few minutes later. "You all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said, and for the first time since he had known her, he wasn't entirely sure if she was telling the truth. Later that evening, Mrs. Bernice told Silas what Mrs. Pearl had whispered, and Silas told Raymond. Raymond listened with that terrifying stillness that takes over a man's body when his anger is too vast for sudden movements. He simply said, "Let it go." But the gala left a mark on him that he didn't forget. The following week, on a Wednesday afternoon, Raymond drove to the school right as the final bell rang. She saw him waiting on the sidewalk and walked out to the gate. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. They walked to the city park under the sprawling live oaks. They sat on a concrete bench. He spent a long minute watching the pigeons peck at the pavement before he spoke. "I heard what Pearl Higgins said to you at the gala." She didn't say a word. "She's dead wrong," he said. "Not because I'll never own a ranch again, maybe I never will, and I'm fine with that, but because what I feel for you has absolutely nothing to do with killing time until things get better. I ain't built like that." Connie looked him straight in the eye. "I know you're not." "So you believed her?" "No." A pause. But it made me think. She was fiercely honest, as she always was. "Not about you. About me. About what I want. And about the sheer panic I feel at the thought of starting something just to lose it again." She took a breath. "I've lost a lot in a very short time, Ray. My childhood home, my mother's memories, my safety net. I'm terrified that people are just things you can lose too." He sat quietly for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice dropping a register. "I lost a whole lot too, and I'm terrified too." He looked at her. "But I reckon fear ain't a good enough reason not to try." She looked at him for a long time. The pigeons cooed. The wind rustled through the thick leaves of the oak trees with that heavy, rushing sound that almost mimics a conversation. "No, it's not," she finally said. And just like that, without a cinematic kiss, without a grand, sweeping speech, what existed between them finally had a name. The months rolled by. Connie kept teaching at the elementary school. Raymond kept turning wrenches at the shop. Slowly they built a shared life. No drama, no flashy romantic gestures, but deeply solid. She brought him a Tupperware lunch to the garage on Wednesdays. He showed up at the school on Fridays so they could walk to the farmers' market together. On Sundays they cooked together in her tiny cottage, navigating that clumsy, wonderful dance of two independent people learning the rhythm of someone else. It was a constant, quiet exchange. From her, the profound patience of a teacher who knows good things take time. From him, an unwavering attention to the small details of her day, which she quickly realized was his way of showing love. He noticed when she was exhausted before she even kicked off her shoes. She learned to tell the difference between the silence of him carrying a heavy memory and the silence of him just feeling at peace, and she handled both with grace. In February 1987, a year and 4 months after the rainstorm, Raymond asked Connie to marry him, not with an expensive diamond ring, because he didn't have the money for one. He proposed with the wooden rosary his mother had left him, one of the very few things he had managed to salvage before handing the ranch over to the bank. It was his only inheritance. She took the beads with the solemnity of a woman who understands the crushing weight of a true offering, and she said yes. The wedding took place in April 1987 at St. Mary's Catholic Church, the exact spot where their eyes had first met. It was a simple ceremony, simple not for lack of desire, but by choice, with the absolute clarity of two people who know exactly what matters. She wore a simple white cotton dress that Silas's wife had helped sew, trimmed with vintage lace that Mrs. Bernice had saved from her own youth. He wore a dark grey suit borrowed from Silas that fit reasonably well. The priest who celebrated the Mass was Father Oswald, a man in his late 60s, who had married generations of folks in the county and possessed the rare gift of talking about love without sounding cheesy. In his homily, he said that a true marriage isn't built on what two people have, but on who they are when they are stripped of everything. And these two, he said, looking down at Raymond and Connie, both of them have stood in the ashes of having nothing, and they chose to rebuild. That is the bedrock that will hold this house together when the storms roll back in. The church held a mixed crowd, their genuine friends who were few but fiercely loyal, the town acquaintances who showed up out of curiosity or social obligation, and sitting near the back, wearing expensive hats and designer dresses, Mrs. Pearl and her daughters, who attended only because skipping it would have been a louder statement than they wanted to make. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and Raymond kissed Connie, a modest, restrained kiss typical of a country man, but anchored with a firmness that left zero room for doubt, a specific kind of hush fell over the sanctuary. It was the silence that happens when something undeniably real and true unfolds in front of people, and they stop making noise for just a second because their souls recognize it. At the reception, held in Silas's backyard with smoked brisket, country music playing on a radio, and that warm April breeze that makes the men finally ditch their suit jackets, Raymond gave a short toast. He was never a man for speeches. But he raised his glass of iced tea to the guests and said, "I lost my ranch and my wife in the same year. I thought I had lost my whole life. But what I learned the hard way was that what I really needed to lose was what I thought defined me." He looked at Connie standing beside him. What she lost in a fire was the house she grew up in, but what she didn't lose, because it can't be burned, is the woman she is. And that's exactly who I found right when I had stopped looking for anything. There was silence afterward, and then applause, not the polite, obligatory clapping of a country club gala, but the kind of applause that erupts from somewhere real inside people. Mrs. Pearl clapped too, Her face remained a perfectly composed mask, but her eyes revealed a bit more defeat than she would have liked. Valerie and Rose left early. Life after the wedding wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. Raymond stayed at the shop with Silas for another 2 years, and during that time, he learned the business side of things so well that Silas began to rely on him entirely for the bookkeeping. In 1989, they made it official. The wooden sign out front was changed to Silas and Vance Auto Repair. It wasn't an 800-acre cattle ranch, but it was something he had helped build with his own 2 hands, and there was a different kind of pride in that. Not the pride of inheriting a kingdom, but the quiet dignity of laying the bricks yourself. Connie stayed at the elementary school. In 1988, she was promoted to curriculum coordinator, which meant more responsibility and a slightly better paycheck. She went back to school, driving to Abilene on Saturdays to get her master's degree, waking up at 5 in the morning to make the drive. When she graduated, there was a small ceremony, and Raymond was there, the only husband sitting in a row of women who had mostly come alone, holding her diploma with a beaming grin that he later admitted was almost embarrassing. I was so proud. They built a house. Not a mansion, a modest 3-bedroom place much like her childhood home, but theirs. They debated every brick, planned every room. It had a wide wraparound porch because Raymond couldn't fathom living in a house without a porch to watch the rain, and it had a large backyard garden because Connie couldn't imagine a kitchen without fresh herbs. In their bedroom, resting on the nightstand, was the wooden rosary and a framed photograph of her mother that a neighbor had managed to drag out of the burning house. The edges were scorched and yellowed, but the face was intact, and there was in the 2 of them a rare aura that folks who visited them could feel but couldn't always name, the profound peace of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. Not the peace of settling for less, but the peace of those who have walked through enough hell to know the true value of a glass of cold water. This story doesn't have a cheap moral meant to wag a finger at you. That's not the kind of lesson worth learning. But it does hold a truth that lingers if you sit with it for a while. Sometimes, the most brutal losses in our lives aren't the end of the road. They are simply the clearing out of everything that was taking up too much space. The oversized pride, the identity that was just a title, the fear of being less without the shield of a family name. Raymond lost the ranch and the wife, and was stripped of what he thought made him a man. Connie lost the house and the material memories of her entire lineage, and was left without her anchor to the world. And it was precisely that emptying out, that exact moment when they were nothing more than themselves, with no property, no inheritance, no social status to hide behind, that made a real connection possible, because when you finally have nothing left to impress the world with, you can finally just be. The storm that drove Connie into Raymond's garage was a storm of thunder and water, the kind the Texas plains produce to remind you who's really in charge. But the storm that prepared them to truly see each other was a different one, an internal, silent, grueling storm that dismantled them both until only the absolute essentials remained. And the essentials, they both discovered, were enough. They were more than enough. Have you ever gone through a devastating loss that, looking back, opened a door you never would have walked through otherwise? Tell me about it in the comments. These real-life experiences are the fuel for the stories we share here. If this story stirred something inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear that new beginnings are always possible, even after the heaviest losses. And if you aren't part of the channel yet, hit that subscribe button. Every week I bring you a new story, and inside every story, a piece of the truth. Until next time.